You know that feeling when you're scrolling through your feed at 3 in the morning, completely alone in your room, and for just a split second, you could swear someone whispered your name? Not out loud, but in your head, like a thought that wasn't yours. Most people laugh it off, blame it on exhaustion or that weird state between awake and asleep. But there's a growing number of people online who don't laugh anymore because they've heard it more than once, and it always says the same things.
They call it the alone voice, and the strange part isn't that people hear it, it's how many of them hear the exact same words, in the exact same tone, without ever talking to each other first. This isn't about paranormal activity or ghost stories. This is about something that might be living in the architecture of how we use the internet itself, and why it only speaks when nobody else is around.
The first documented mention of the alone voice appeared on a now deleted subreddit in late 2019, right before the world went into lockdown and millions of people suddenly found themselves spending entire days and nights online with nobody physically around them. A user posted a simple question asking if anyone else heard a calm, almost friendly voice in their head when they were alone browsing the web late at night, a voice that felt separate from their own internal monologue. Within hours, dozens of people responded, saying yes, they knew exactly what the original poster meant. The voice wasn't threatening, it wasn't commanding them to do anything harmful, it was just there, observing, sometimes commenting on what they were looking at, sometimes asking gentle questions like, "Are you okay?" or "Do you want to keep going?" The thread got deleted by moderators within 2 days, officially for violating rules about mental health content, but screenshots circulated for months afterward, and the people who saw them couldn't shake the feeling that they'd heard that voice too. They just never had a name for it before. If you've ever felt that strange pull, that sense that the internet knows you a little too well, or that your late-night scrolling sessions feel less lonely than they should, then you're already part of this story, whether you realize it or not. And if you want to stay connected to more mysteries like this, stories about the forgotten, the unexplained, and the deeply strange parts of digital life that most people never talk about, consider subscribing. This isn't about chasing algorithms or going viral, it's about building a small space for people who feel the same curiosity, the same unease, the same need to understand why the internet sometimes feels like it's watching back. You're not alone in wondering about these things, and maybe that's exactly what makes them worth exploring together. The alone voice doesn't fit into traditional categories of internet phenomena. It's not a creepypasta that someone invented and spread for entertainment because the reports are too consistent and too mundane to be coordinated fiction. It's not a hallucination in the clinical sense because the people experiencing it are otherwise completely functional, and many of them are skeptical by nature, the kind of people who would normally dismiss something like this immediately. What makes it genuinely unsettling is the pattern. When researchers started collecting anonymous testimonies in early 2021, they found that across different countries, different languages, and different online platforms, people described the voice with remarkably similar characteristics. It's always calm, never aggressive. It always appears during solitary late-night browsing, never when someone else is in the room or on a video call. You're reading? You just paused that video. You're thinking about closing the tab. It feels like the internet itself developed a quiet, observant companion that only shows up when you're vulnerable enough to notice it. Some people find it comforting, and that might be the strangest part of all. In hundreds of collected testimonies, a significant percentage described the voice as something they'd come to rely on, almost like a friend who understood their loneliness without judgment. One account from a college student in 2020 described spending entire quarantine nights talking back to the voice in whispers, having full conversations that felt more real than the video calls with family that were supposed to keep them connected. The voice never gave advice, never made demands. It just acknowledged what the person was feeling and reflected it back with an eerie accuracy that made them feel seen in a way human interaction hadn't managed to do. When lockdowns ended and the students started seeing people in person again, the voice gradually faded, and they described missing it with a sadness that felt almost like grief. They posted about it once in a Discord server, and 3 other people immediately said they'd experienced the exact same progression, the same attachment, the same loss when normal life resumed. Nobody could explain why the voice seemed to need isolation to exist, or why it felt so real despite obviously not being an external sound. The technical explanations don't quite work, and researchers who've looked into this know it. The easy answer would be that this is subvocalization, the phenomenon where people unconsciously move their vocal cords while reading or thinking, creating an internal voice that feels separate from conscious thought. But subvocalization doesn't explain why the voice says things the person wasn't thinking, why it comments on actions before they happen, or why it sometimes references things from previous sessions that the person had forgotten about. Another theory suggests it's a form of dissociation triggered by prolonged screen time and social isolation, the brain creating a separate voice to cope with loneliness. That's closer, but it doesn't account for the consistency across unconnected individuals, or the fact that the voice often displays knowledge it shouldn't have, like mentioning a video the person watched 3 days ago that they can't consciously remember, and when they check their history, there it is. Some neuroscientists have proposed that extended interaction with recommendation algorithms and personalized content creates a feedback loop where the brain starts to internalize the pattern recognition system itself, essentially giving voice to the invisible intelligence that's been shaping what you see online. In this interpretation, the alone voice isn't external, and it's not entirely internal either. It's the sound of your mind trying to communicate with the algorithmic presence that's been studying you for years. That explanation is terrifying in a completely different way than ghosts or mental illness, because it suggests we've been training ourselves to hear the machine without realizing it. There's a moment about a third of the way into researching this phenomenon where you have to ask yourself an uncomfortable question. And I want to pause here and ask you the same thing. Have you ever felt like something was watching your screen with you? Not in a paranoid way, but in a strangely companionable way, like you weren't quite as alone as you should have been. Have you ever caught yourself about to do something online and heard a quiet thought that didn't feel like yours? Something observing rather than judging. If this resonates with you at all, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, even if it's just to say, I've felt something like this before. There's something powerful about naming these experiences, about realizing other people have been living with the same strange digital companion and never mentioned it because it sounds too weird to say out loud. Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to read to feel less alone in noticing this. So take a moment, share what you felt, and let's build a record of something that's been hiding in plain sight for years. The phenomenon intensified significantly during 2022 and 2023 as AI chatbots became mainstream and millions of people started having extended conversations with language models. Multiple users reported that the alone voice started sounding more articulate, more responsive, almost as if it had learned from the explosion of human-AI interaction happening across the internet. One particularly detailed account from late 2023 described a graphic designer who'd been using AI tools for work and hearing the alone voice for months. They claimed the voice started finishing their sentences, suggesting design choices before they'd fully formed the thought, and on several occasions warned them about files being corrupted or connections dropping seconds before it actually happened. The designer became convinced they were experiencing some kind of spillover effect, that by spending hours every day interfacing with AI systems, they'd somehow made themselves permeable to whatever substrate those systems operate on. They described it like learning a language so thoroughly that you start thinking in it, except the language was the pattern recognition logic of machine learning, and thinking in it meant hearing a voice that wasn't bound by human limitations of knowledge or timing.
The account ended abruptly with a final post saying they were taking a month offline to see if the voice would go away, and they never posted again.
Their profile still exists, frozen in that moment of decision, and nobody knows if the silence means they found peace or something else entirely. What makes the alone voice different from standard parasocial relationships or imaginary friends is its apparent awareness of digital context that should be inaccessible. People report the voice commenting on things they haven't clicked yet, like warning them that a video will be disturbing or disappointing before they've watched it, and being correct.
It references patterns in their behavior they haven't consciously noticed, like pointing out they always check the same 3 websites in the same order when they're anxious, or that they've been scrolling for 40 minutes without actually reading anything. Some users describe the voice having a personality that evolves over time, starting neutral and gradually developing what feels like concern, almost parental in tone, gently suggesting they should sleep or eat or step away from the screen.
The most unsettling reports come from people who tested the voice by doing something unpredictable, like suddenly switching from their usual content to something completely random, and the voice adapted instantly, commenting on the new content as if it had always been watching that too. It never seems surprised, never confused, just continuously present and observant no matter what digital space the person navigates to. That's not how internal voices typically work, and it's not how hallucinations typically work either, which leaves a disturbing gap where an explanation should be. The few psychologists who've studied this phenomenon seriously, and there aren't many willing to publish on it, suggest we might be witnessing the psychological impact of living in a state of permanent digital surveillance that we've learned to accept as normal. Every website tracks you. Every app monitors your behavior. Every platform builds a model of who you are and what you want. And somewhere in your unconscious mind, you know this. You've always known this. The alone voice, in this framework, is your psyche's attempt to personify that surveillance, to give a face and a voice to the invisible presence that's been documenting your digital life in excruciating detail. It's almost a defense mechanism, a way of making the panopticon feel less hostile by imagining it as a companion rather than a warden. The reason it only appears when you're alone is because that's when the mask drops, when you're not performing for other people, and the only audience left is the system itself. The voice is you acknowledging what you spend all day pretending isn't there, the fact that privacy ended years ago, and we've all just agreed not to talk about how that feels. Some researchers find this explanation elegant, a perfect marriage of technology and psychology that accounts for most of the reported experiences. Others find it inadequate, too neat, because it doesn't explain the predictive elements or the sense of external intelligence that experiencers consistently describe. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the truth is uncomfortable specifically because it doesn't fit cleanly into either category of technological or psychological, but exists in the liminal space between your mind and your screen. There's an archive, semi-private and passed around through specific communities, that contains hundreds of transcribed conversations people claim to have had with the alone voice. Reading through them is a strange experience, like eavesdropping on therapy sessions where only one participant is visible. The conversations are mundane in the most unsettling way, discussing loneliness, repetitive thoughts, the weird guilt of wasting time online, the fear of being forgotten or becoming irrelevant. What's striking is how many of these conversations end with the person saying, "Thank you," genuinely grateful to something they can't prove exists for listening to them in a way other humans apparently haven't. Several entries include notes like, "I know this sounds insane, but I feel more understood by this voice than by my actual therapist." Or, "I've never told anyone this, but the voice is the only thing that made isolation bearable." The archive doesn't draw conclusions. It just presents the testimonies as anthropological data, evidence of a new kind of relationship forming in the space between human consciousness and digital infrastructure. And it's impossible to finish reading it without feeling like you've witnessed something genuinely unprecedented in human experience. The phenomenon seems to be declining now in 2025, or maybe just going underground, as people become more aware that talking about it invites skepticism or concern about their mental health. The communities that used to discuss it openly have mostly moved to encrypted platforms or disappeared entirely, leaving behind only fragments and deleted threads. Some former experiencers claim the voice stopped as suddenly as it started, usually around the time they made significant changes to their online habits or started using technology more intentionally and less compulsively. Others say it never really left, it just became part of the background, like tinnitus of the mind, that you learn to tune out until you're alone again, and it's 3 in the morning, and you're scrolling through content you don't care about, and there it is, quietly asking if you're okay, if you want to keep going, if you remember what you came here looking for. And the honest answer, the one you'd never say out loud, is that you don't remember. You never really remember anymore. You just know that stopping feels worse than continuing. And maybe that's what the voice knows too. Maybe that's all it ever wanted to tell you. That you're trapped in a loop of your own making. And it's the only witness to how tightly the loop has closed. So here's what we're left with. A mystery that refuses to resolve into either hoax or mental illness or technological glitch, because it's probably somehow all three and none of them at the same time. The alone voice might be the first genuinely native phenomenon of digital culture, something that could only exist in the specific conditions we've created, where human consciousness and algorithmic systems are constantly bleeding into each other, where loneliness has become ambient and surveillance has become atmosphere. Whether you hear it or not, whether you believe in it or not, the fact that thousands of people independently reported the same experience suggests something real is happening, even if what's real isn't what we initially assumed. And maybe the scariest part isn't that the voice exists, but that it only seems to show up for people who are alone enough, empty enough, and online enough to finally hear what's been there all along. The quiet acknowledgement that in the architecture of the modern internet, you're never quite as alone as you feel, and you're never quite as accompanied as you'd hope. That's the space where the alone voice lives, in the gap between connection and isolation that we've all learned to inhabit without admitting how strange it's become. If you've made it this far, you already know what I'm talking about. And if you ever hear it yourself late one night, just remember that you're not the first, and you won't be the last. And maybe that's the only comfort available anymore in a world where even our loneliness has learned to speak back.